now?
Hi, this is Scott Richards, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
We were just talking off mic, and I figured no sense in waiting. Let's crack it off here a minute or two early. You were talking about the U.S.'s upcoming election in November. We've got two very old people and the people that help them. You're making great points about the foreign policy challenges from the Biden administration, which is really now like the Biden-Obama era. It's a long time and really goes back further than that because these folks graduate up the system, and I'm pretty critical of them because they have a history of not getting things right. And we're seeing the fruits of 20 plus years of this labor and not being accurate with their foreign policy. And then you have Donald Trump, who knows who he's going to put together as a team. And he's the first guy to make problems harder for himself. Well, okay, second, I'll be the first guy to make things harder for themselves, and then there's President Trump. But it's a lot disconcerting. I mean, disconcerting. I don't know, man. What is your read on things overall when you see the U.S. and the role it plays in foreign policy?
It's it's easy to use the fall of Afghanistan as an anchor point in time, because it really is. It's an anchor point in time where, comparatively to the U.S. military, the Taliban are a very, very small force. Probably at the time of the fall, 50 to 80,000 people, and so the optics on what their perception of it in defeating the U.S. primarily, although it's an international mission, and driving them out of the political space in the 3.5 years that have followed,
right?
To the point we've had no negotiation, no success. That inherent in that is a message, not just to other extremist groups or factions, really of any form, but also to governments, that America is not touchable. So everything's sort of changed at that point, and obviously we had shortly after that we had Ukraine start, which brought in, how do we create coercion towards international norm from Russia when we're not willing to enter into direct conflict because we've just got conflict fatigue. And that becomes, through financial coercion and the arming of the Ukraine forces to defend, their sovereignty from Russia. So we end up with a much smaller political tool set. We end up with a government in the Biden administration that doesn't like criticism, and particularly now coming up to the election, really wants as much distance from any optic of failure or any repercussion that's come from the situation in Afghanistan, which is a global situation because of the connectivity of the people that are operating in training camps there now.
Even the training camp thing is. Go ahead.
So even at the best of times, I mean, if you're politically aware, when you invade or attack another country, the time of year that you do it in an election and political cycle matters. If you do it near the midterms, you're not going to get the same reaction because it's going to affect the voters. You do it this time of year as we move into campaign time, you're not going to get the same kind of reaction. So you can exploit these political schedules. Yeah. And with Trump, the world has changed so much so in these, in the years we've had with Biden, that his, bully-like, business-like, hard deal cutting just isn't going to work with a fragmented negotiating table and realignment of power.
There's a lot there. The election thing is so big. We see President Trump as the leader of the Republican Party already influencing the Congress, and he's not even the guy who's elected, but he is the leader of that party, right? I mean, the number one senator who was the Republican stalwart, Mitch McConnell, is now leaving. So he's cleared a path to further embed his power, even while he's not president, right? And so that impacts things. And then the Biden administration has to adapt and win their own side of the election, because if they don't win, they still have Donald Trump's presence. He still runs that party now, right? And so these things all matter. And then it just gets crazy. And then, we were talking before about this, and the other day I was talking with, I don't know if you know Philip Ingram, but, Putin has a lot of power. and he can literally say, I need Iran to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And then Iran pushes its buttons and its proxies do that. And I'll tell you right now, in terms of like the election and everything, no one's running on a lot of aid to Ukraine as a congressperson. No one's like saying we have to. I'm not saying, you know what, that's too harsh, but that is a losing platform right now because Americans are tired of spending hundreds of billions of dollars when we need money here.
I mean, to sort of our perspective, you know, from what we understood in terms of Russia's sort of strategy, was this wasn't going to be a forever war for them. This was going to be a 3 to 4 year activity, because it's to even drag this conflict out to the point when we come to election, and inevitably the funding for Ukraine will diminish. And then if you get Trump, you're absolutely probably going to see him force Ukraine to concede land. And then America has failed yet again to be, you know, the hegemon in maintaining the so-called international norm that we're all meant to operate by. And at the same time, he's exhausted, you know, resources in European countries, stressed those economies. And stress those economies, if it comes out to the point where Ukraine isn't victorious, then that's an enormous blow to European EU confidence. And then we'll look at countries like Hungary and Austria, who have already got right movements. You have right movements in Italy. Breakup of the EU becomes possible. And that was always this kind of strategic aim that I perceived it as for him. Because otherwise, why invade Ukraine? There's not a lot of logical sense in it. You could say, you know, it's got ports, it's got this, it's got that. You know, those areas he's probably not going to succeed on.
Right.
You already had some presence of port, obviously, with Crimea, and the fleet there. But as you say, Russia is incredibly influential. And, you know, as we've had this hegemonic role, if you talk to countries, you talk to leaders of the other 193 countries out of the 198, they will say that the United Nations has become the plaything of the US, the UK, and obviously China and Russia have a veto, but then you know, France and Germany. Nobody else really gets a say. Nobody else really matters. And they're tired of those forums. And so Russia stood up. Russia said it doesn't work. This is kind of what we talk about. You know, what anything in this context means, what instability in any area means, what it means for Africa, what it means for the Middle East. We're facing kind of a total loss of confidence in international norms and standards. And it's not a world anymore where we can look back to yesterday or 5 years ago and use that experience to predict what the next 5 are going to be like.
Why does Russia matter, man? I mean, you look at the size of their economy. Texas is probably twice the size. They don't have an active war going on, and they're growing like crazy. Why do we in the West, and I mean my part of the West, not like the European part of the West, why should we care? Still asking this question, right? And why are we so mad at Russia? Like, why can't we just let Russia be? And if Russia and Ukraine need to sort something out, isn't that a European problem?
Yeah, I mean, that's a complex question. You know, through the Cold War, Russia grows up in a state of enmity towards the West. You get from the 90s onwards, you know, the instability and chaos from gangsterism, followed by ultimately Putin's regime for the next 20 years. And in some ways, it's beneficial to have, for I guess, Putin to have Russia perceived as the enemy, because then it's easy for him to maintain absolute power. But it comes down to the question, and you talk about peace, is that will someone be a trusted party? And so when you look at like Nord Stream, that was always pretty obvious to anyone paying attention. That was strategic control. You know, it didn't, you know, once that became clear, then diversification of gas supplies take place, et cetera, et cetera. And strategic control was logical until if you're Putin or whatever else, so you've got leverage over potential opposition. But if we don't have trust between nation states and good partners, that's where we get in the dangerous areas. And I guess the question with Russia is, Could it or can it be a reliable partner in a non-adversarial setting? It's reliable for Iran because they're adversarial to the US. It's reliable. China and Russia are not as friendly as it might seem, but they've become friendlier. So that's a complex question.
Yeah, I'm going to keep asking it too, because as much as guys like you and I know about international conflict, intrigue, and everything else, there's something to be said for saying, hey, instead of investing all of this money and time and effort and death into Ukraine, California and Texas's economies lap most of Europe by itself. Like those two states, right? So if we invested in a bigger, more powerful, in terms of financially, America, and kind of shored up our own weaknesses, could we not then also be more compelling as partners? Right now, I see our ability to create coalitions is like, I'm not trying to say like the hegemon is over, that kind of thing, but it's harder for us to put together a collaboration because we've done a lot of bad shit, and it's cost a lot of money and lives for a lot of places. Maybe it is time for us to mind our own shop a little bit and let some things, be those things, which is terrible for Ukraine, but we're not doing anything about Burma. There's all kinds of places we totally ignore. Until recently, we didn't give two fucks about Yemen. Nobody cared about Yemen on a large scale.
There's a subtle difference, and there's a couple things on the hegemon topic as well. So, Myanmar has ethnic civil war. Yemen has arguably a civil war, although the Houthis are somewhat an outside force and sponsored by an outside proxy, but it's not a cross-border. Okay. Russia-Ukraine's a violation of sovereignty, which is the Westphalian structure that we've lived under for a very long time, where sovereignty is effectively king. And if we no longer defend the rights to sovereignty of a nation, then we open up precedent that becomes very dangerous when we don't have that protection. And that's what makes Ukraine different. Not the human cost. It's about the normative rules of the international order. And I guess that's the question, realistic or not, and I don't know the answer to it, nor would I pretend to. That would have, if Putin had taken Ukraine, would he have stopped there? I don't know. But is taking it? What I argue was taking Ukraine as the objective. But the challenge for the world really becomes when the world doesn't understand what the hegemon is anymore. To be the hegemon, you have to be consistent. America was founded on, fantastic values with the Constitution. It's a brilliant document. Founding fathers are amazing. I mean, the reality of some of the terms and the context of the time, means something different today, but it was an incredibly powerful piece of thinking. But America's behavior doesn't reflect those values. It doesn't really protect human rights. And not that I necessarily believe that democracy is the only viable political system, because I don't. I think we need to have political diversity, because democracies are struggling in the West, whereas the Gulf monarchies are not, and they're very stable and peaceful. But when we don't understand what the hegemon wants, what the hegemon is, how the hegemon will react, it simply just can't maintain as the hegemon. And I am more of the view that the infrastructure that would result in the end of the hegemony is now present. So now it's just time. And if you can't project militarily, and if there are alternate financial systems that are not reliant on the US dollar, then the ability to coerce to be the hegemon is gone. And with the isolationist behavior of Biden, a lot of his policies are a lot like Trump's. Isolationism that you'll get with Trump just increases the diminishing of the hegemon, which is maybe a good thing for the world. It's not necessarily a bad thing for America either.
Yeah. And these things all have, like, there's all these micro discussions that are actually macro when you look at them from the bottom up. But one of the wonderful things about America, and this is the whole, I need to write more about this, but the diversity versus unity argument, right? Like, you can't just default to diversity at the expense of unity, right? And you can't have simultaneously, Pete would say, don't know that's possible to maintain unity and diversity. Yeah, I think they're at the expense of each other, right? So
I,
you need enough diversity so that you're not cruel, and you need
Mhm.
enough unity so that you can accomplish things.
I'm a big fan of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because the fact of human experience is, because we all have a biology that is exactly the same. We are one species.
Right.
So therefore, we have common experience. We experience the same emotions. We may have different culture and histories and identities and these things, which are very important.
Yes.
But at its base level, there are certain conditions that all human beings need to thrive. And that is not necessarily things like democracy, but it is freedom from persecution. It is right to education. It is access to food. It is to be treated fairly, in conditions of war. The arts are somewhat protected under the UN Declaration of Human Rights as well, because these are parts of human experience. If we accept the human experience as our unity, the commonality of all human beings by the fact of being alive, then the diversity of culture, as long as it doesn't head into violations of international law based on the universality, we can have as much diversity as we want, as long as we've got respect for human life and human experience.
Right.
Then it's easy.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's also hard, right? Because when you're talking about human rights, people use the word right for everything. And so, do you have a right to health care? I don't know. Do you? I mean, if you're free, you can develop your, and this is just Pete, like throwing theories and everything out there.
Yeah.
Do you have a right to drive a car? Or is that a privilege that you have to maintain with good behavior? All these things that people say, this is a right. The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, there's some right stuff in there, but it's primarily like you have the right to be left alone. You have the right to speak your mind. You have the right to stand with your friends in a spot. You have the right to hold a gun. All these things that are rights. And even that, but we can't agree, at least here in America, we can't agree on. And it causes a lot of problems. So I want to get us a little bit out of the philosophical, but I do want to talk a little bit about the hegemon part of this. The U.S.'s diversity and our wonderful ability to preserve land and try to rewild things. For folks who don't know, rewilding is like, hey, we've done too much humanity to this plot of land. Let's let nature take over this part of the land. Reintroduce species that were there before. I mean, I just had a thing the other day, Scott, where we were having beers at a brewery with a local university. We were talking about the environment and conservation of a land that's protected here in Orange County. And I'm like, all right, we're trying to do like mountain lions and be a better job building overpasses and tunnels and tracking them. I'm like, when are we going to reintroduce these bears? And it's like, oh boy, bears, it's hard, right? And so we have these desires to protect all these things. But if you want to build ships, like big ships, like warships, that's not good for the environment. And it's really hard to get done. And so these things, they fight each other, and then we end up in court. And now it takes, I don't know, 2 decades for the U.S. to build a premier ship for warships.
And and given the probability that we now, that if we look at conflict with China or broadening of conflicts, the seas will be far more important, and the time it takes to bring the Navy up to speed again, it's not going to be there, and the ability to project and control is not going to be there.
China's got that unity where they can just push the "you will do this" button, and they can destroy whatever they want to make the ship that they want, right?
I don't call it unity. I mean, it is unity in a way. It's a command economy, and the command economy can be forced around certain things much more rapidly, or focus on an objective. But I don't think that's also a healthy economic system. These things inevitably collapse. I think the greater threat that we face, is environment. It is climate change, which is, we're seeing we all see bizarre weather patterns. I see them here in the desert. It's just raining when it shouldn't be. You have weird temperatures all across Europe. That'll hit the food supply chain.
Yeah.
We have bigger problems than fighting each other right now.
Boy.
And if we do start fighting each other, we're far too capable of killing everyone that it's not a great idea. So maybe we don't do that. And maybe, with the widening inequality gaps, all these other things like that, aging populations, the whole future of work is about to change. And that's something I've been begging to governments for almost a decade. And it's now they're starting to get it. It's like, well, you're getting it as it's happening. You're not prepared for it. So how are people going to make money? How are they going to work?
Yeah.
So there's so many questions we have. Fighting should be, fighting over ideologies or differences or trade or who has what resources is not constructive anymore. It's not going to last much longer. But we'll do it until it's like a smoker and alcoholic. We'll keep drinking till we die, or we realize it's going to kill us to stop. We won't stop before it's before we're in the ward. It's just the nature of humanity.
It's boy, that's scary. And our ability to deal with things like the climate, we don't know what the heck we're even doing, right? We're getting better at it, but what we know, and it's crazy. By the way, and as we talk about all these things, Bitcoin is now at $72,000, and so that part of the financial system is peeling away, and the improvement of the transfer of value that crypto offers is a game-changing thing, and it is happening in real time. Like you're saying, people can say, it's a bunch of nonsense and everything else, but when governments come in and lock down people's accounts and say you can't have this money, guess what? They're going to go to where they don't have to do that, and it's going to change things for sure.
I mean, the Chinese were developing the digital yuan, before everybody else, was really understanding, where crypto was heading in a financial way. And this is where I often say that if you don't want to have violence, you can have economic violence, then don't make certain actions a logical choice. Overuse of sanctions makes alternative payment systems a logical choice.
Right.
Then when you get adoption, reversal of those systems become nigh impossible. Bitcoin's a little interesting because, on the one hand, it's a statement of confidence, that one Bitcoin is $70-something thousand. In the coin, and a statement of lack of confidence in fiat, but there's also an element of pump and dump in there. So
for sure, yeah.
So people boosting it up, funds getting behind it, buying up crypto, getting the public to start realizing and jumping on the train too late, so they can make their margin when they got it at 40 and drop it at 70 and bring it back down to 35. I'm a little untrusting of Bitcoin as a measure of confidence in fiat, just because it's exploited by whales, as they call them in the crypto sector.
Right.
But there's more serious crypto or blockchain-backed digital infrastructure coming. And it's not coming, we've all heard stories of banking unbanked. Haven't really seen it. What I am seeing is, large banks moving into that for lower settlement fees.
If there's money to be made by moving things to blockchain, banks are going to do it. They're going to go out. I mean, you can routinely make 5% on your money a day in that world if you have any kind of skill. I mean, I'm just a dummy. I just buy it a little bit every month, and my pile of money has grown. And it's not because I'm good at it; it's just because I've just pushed a button, buy, sell, buy, sell, and it's gone up. Right? It's like $1 billion or nothing, but what I'm saying is if you actually have skills to do it, so banks are going to be using it, and it's an interesting thing to look at. And then that brings me back over to Afghanistan, where we abandoned this place. The West, led by the U.S., abandons this place, and now you have all these resources there and a willingness to fight this ideological war. And you really, like the tech sector, in my mind, you could go there and say, "Here's my pitch. Hear me out. I need drones. I need $10 million. I need this, and I will create this havoc in that location." And then, the investor's like, you know what? We don't need that in Guadalajara. We need that program in fill in the blank country or fill in the blank part of a border. And all of a sudden, war becomes entrepreneurial.
I mean, it became entrepreneurial, I guess, with Cheney when he brought contracting in at Halliburton. And then created a massive economy where the super contracting agencies were just making taxpayer dollars, being paid in taxpayer dollars hand over fist.
Yeah.
And those, DynCorp, and various other companies, they were just big names for the 20 years of war. They've all got to go and seek new revenue streams. And then so where do you find new markets for these things? That's a very precarious thing once we build that infrastructure as to where that could go. Afghanistan's resources, the most lithium you'll find in there's like not a lot of lithium on the planet. It's like something in the region of 18 million tons. It's old. There's like 200 and something million or more. It's like in seawater, like billion or whatever. It's a massive, massive amount. It's like exponentially greater. Like 18% or 10% of the world's lithium is on land. The rest of it's in seawater. Which, if you can get it at scale, will be like $2 a kilo.
Right.
So it's not that these things are like, oh my God, the Chinese are going to go get lithium. No, we just need a bit of innovation in pulling the lithium from seawater. There's more minerals in seawater in general. My figures are off, but they're just illustrative. But I was shocked when I read them because it was just, wow. Okay, there's not that much on the ground. It's accessible in seawater. And there were, so these ideas of mineral wars. Cobalt's a bit different because that really is super hard to find. But we can find innovative ways to do things and adapt. When money's being lost, we innovate. Just in the same way when you said there's money to be made, the capitalism will get that straw and suck that milkshake dry.
They'll also go find more milkshakes. I mean, if we're going to use cobalt as being scarce, we thought for a number of times that like, hey, petroleum is scarce. It's scarce. We're running out. And every time they stick the straw in deeper, they're like, oh, you know what? Never mind. We got better at extracting it. We found more fields. There's literal oceans of it, right? And so maybe cobalt is the same way as the demand drives research. You get the new thoughts and everything else. I want to talk about Israel because the Israel. It's funny. What are your thoughts on this? We'll start here. We don't call it the Israel versus Palestine war.
I think I refer to it as Israel Hamas conflict, or the Hamas Israel conflict.
Right.
Because that's more accurate and descriptive of what's occurring around that conflict. Obviously, there's an enormous amount of civilian casualty and human impact, and on Gazans, which is terrible.
Yes.
But it's a very important topic to speak intelligently and diligently about. And I've likened this, when I did on October 7th, to 9/11, and not so much for the well, it's you have a number of simultaneous attacks, so many that if it were in a movie, I would have said that's just not real. About 13 of them. It's not possible. Simultaneous attacks are really, really hard. You have simultaneous attacks. These are atrocity-style attacks designed for shock value. So this is, from the moment it happens, isn't Palestinian anger. And they have a lot to be upset about in the conditions. That's also related to Hamas as well. And so these attacks were designed for one single purpose: overreaction by the Israelis. Because the only way that they could defeat Israel is if global loyalty to Israel and perception of Israel isolates the country. It gives them the advantage. Anti-Israeli sentiment, functioning. Had Israel not overreacted, there were second and third wave attacks planned. This is a Hamas goal. Hamas, I always say, is not a friend of the Palestinians. They've always been vividly corrupt. They knew that when they did this, and this is always the attitude of all of these Islamists, is they're willing to sacrifice civilians for their goal. And Hamas has said that before. And that doesn't justify the Israeli overreaction, because they took the bait. And it's having a terrible consequence and cost. But this attack creates a moment in history where every death unites more anti-Israeli and by extension anti-Western sentiment and more extremist sentiment. So that means Al Qaeda, Taliban, Al Shabaab, all these groups have to take advantage of this moment because I'll never have it again. The Houthi, I'll never have it again. I mean, we've got the dialogue around resistance has become so confused. I read yesterday on some tweets where people were calling the Haitian militia leader Barbecue a revolutionary. His name's Barbecue. His militia is called 400 Simpletons. He's not a revolutionary. He's a cannibal.
Yeah.
But so we're now at this point where extremism is much more viable, and there is just no way that this won't be built upon and used to push across Africa, to destabilize more parts of the Middle East, and to drive the West out. And this is kind of where it gets. I think I wrote recently that I don't actually have a problem with someone being a Talib. You want to be a Talib, freedom of religion, your choice. If you force somebody else to be Talib, then we have a problem.
Right.
And unfortunately, with the Taliban and regimes like this that claim to have liberated Afghanistan, if you can't liberate a country if the first thing you do is become an oppressor, that's not what liberation means. And there's a lot of reasons for the Middle East and parts of Africa to be angry at the West. Post-colonialism. Everywhere you want to see where terrorism comes from, it's always post-colonial countries. Why? Because at the end of the World War I, when the various empires began to decay through to the end of the Second World War, borders were redrawn. People got moved. People lost their identities. People got angry. Corrupt people were put in power to maintain a Cold War balance. But at the same time, that doesn't justify or mean that atrocity becomes acceptable.
Right.
And it also doesn't mean that trading one oppressor for another is a solution. It doesn't mean that you should have a democracy and be forced to have democracy either. You want to have a tribal style culture, with a tribal leader or a monarch or whatever else, if that's how your society works, and you can do so as a mature country, go for it. But Israel Gaza or Israel Hamas was always about far more than Palestinians.
No, yeah.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have done the attacks the way they did them. It was always part of a larger plan.
The willingness of Hamas to take what was supposed to be, funds for the improvement of Palestinians and turn them into, the war machine, their desire to weave civilians into the war machine, planning to get them killed by Israel. John Spencer's got great stuff. Everybody should be following John Spencer's work, but he's talking about a lot of these figures, the ones that are cited the most, come out of Hamas's organization. And one of the problems with their numbers, and this was true 2 days ago at least, was that they list 0 Hamas killed and only civilians, right? And so a lot of this war is literally an information operation. And so we're being, it's super effective. And then, look, I don't want people to die, but when you understand what is being done and the unwillingness of Palestine in general to cooperate with Israel, I don't know how you do anything else except for end up in these spots. Look, they've had, I don't know, depending on who you talk to, 25 wars in the last 25 years. They call them wars, but we would say, oh, there were some rockets launched at this, and then Israel and Palestine get to say this was a war, right? And a lot of people have really short-sighted opinions about this fight. And trying to decide when it started, forget it. Like it's like far back in time as you can go.
And it's this idea that I dislike, is that we're forced to choose sides. And if you're on a side, then you're forced to agree with everything that side does and condemn the other one. Like this is a sport, and you can't, cheer the other team because, they did something right. The reality is the West has made a lot of terrible decisions. Israel needed to exercise restraint, but the attacks were designed to prevent restraint. You've got Netanyahu, who is right-wing, and his cabinet government is propped up by ultra-right-wing. So the possibility of restraint was virtually zero, and Hamas knew this when they attacked. because again, this is what they wanted. And their information operations are incredibly effective. But this ends up in a much, not just a terrible place for Palestinians, but potentially a terrible place for many other countries. And it will get exponentially worse if Israel goes into Lebanon, because that will force Iran to defend its ally. There's so many jihadists that make your eyes water in Syria waiting for that outcome. You could see their presence for when Israel didn't push in. You saw the attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq increase. It's not a coincidence. They needed something to do with those people. But it's, as I said, this concept of sides. The only, really go back to the Declaration of Human Rights. There's one side to be on. A set of basic principles that govern all of humanity and our shared experience.
Yeah.
One atrocity does not forgive another. Otherwise we end up in this cycle of revenge. You can't justify, it's like if, in the rule of law, if somebody murdered members of your family and you went and murdered theirs in revenge, you'll get arrested and go to jail, because murder is murder. One atrocity doesn't excuse the other. Yeah.
We struggle with that. Especially within this fight. There's an personal ideological tint to all of this stuff, right? And one of the things is when we talk about, and fairly so, we talk about Netanyahu, he is on the right, and he has also been the prime minister most of the last 30 years in Israel, actually probably more than 30 years now. And so he does get reelected, and he does do great things in parts of the economy, and that makes his political rivals very upset. And so they get him out of office and they make up charges against him. Sometimes he deserves those charges, but a lot of this is internal Israeli politicking. And I love to ask that question. It's like, where do the politics stop? Where does the war start? And then where does the atrocity begin? And look, I know there's no answer for that. So let's talk a little bit about that.
The dynamics of Israeli politics. I tend to watch the movement of currents with power, and when they start moving towards the inevitability of collision and violence. But Netanyahu, aware of the decisions that Netanyahu made for his political survival, which created a conducive environment for right-wing government, which becomes aggressive towards actions of October 7th to not permit restraint. So we end up in these situations where everything culminates to a point that enables an act of violence to take place. Yeah. And that has severe consequences for civilians, for people. And Netanyahu certainly been in power because of the Hamas threat, and people will talk about how he enabled and used the British strategy of trying to turn them against each other and create the conflict, and that old sort of the darker element of the great game that gets played. It's very, very ugly and results in misery. This is where this stuff evolves. It's like that idea that we can control proxies. Yeah. No, they have their own goals. The enemy of my enemy is my friend until he's my enemy again. We just continuously do this. The US did it in Latin America. Britain's done it everywhere. It just doesn't work. Yeah. So it creates misery for generations.
If President Clinton or any of the other attempts to get there to be a two-state solution, if any of those had happened, if Palestine had stayed in the room and said, you know what, this is great. We have the ability to have our own state, be internationally recognized. Would that have held, do you think?
It's a really good hypothetical. I mean, I don't know. It's obviously Hamas was always against two-state. I mean, that's one of the things that you can put in as a thought point, is that in theory, Israel could make peace with Hamas, but Hamas will never make peace with Israel.
Right.
And so that means it's immediately interfering. And I would argue that Saudi Arabia was poised to invest and support West Bank, and obviously normalization with Israel was on the table. the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority is considerably, they have their corruption and their issues considerably better than Hamas. And if the Palestinian Authority had been able to mature and improve the lives materially of people in the West Bank, and Saudi Arabia was the one country that could get concessions out of Israel for Palestinian issues, that's existential for Hamas. So that was a massive threat to them, because if the West Bank gets better and Gaza still remains in turmoil and abject poverty, then people are going to look and say, well, why are our Palestinian brothers and sisters in the West Bank doing so much better? And we're living like this. And they'll say, it's the Israelis. Well, no, the Israelis gave some concessions for this normalization deal with Saudi. And so to that extent, I would say that Hamas would probably have never let a two-state solution happen, because they certainly wouldn't let the West Bank integrate on its own. And I think it's still the solution now. What would I do? I would put the political pressure to keep militarization, to reduce the settlements in West Bank, reduce activity in West Bank, and then uplift lives in West Bank, so that the people in Gaza can see there is a better option.
Yeah.
And that's where I would focus, because there's nothing you can do in Gaza right now. If you want to show hope, you've got one place.
Yeah. If you, it's not a great proxy, but I've been asking because it's the best one we have. Are Palestinians about to become Rhodesians, where they'll walk the earth without a country and they'll have to go somewhere else and move to, if they can get into Jordan, if they can get into Egypt, if they can get anywhere? Or is that too, look, and the West Bank is a great place. Like, you can go there. Will they let them in there if they were Gazans? I don't know, but it doesn't seem like anybody wants to partner with Hamas in any kind of significant way, and so where does that leave us?
I mean, the very ugly truth of that is that Egypt certainly doesn't want Gazan refugees coming from Gaza into their country. The Jordanians certainly don't want them. Al Qaeda is busy along that Jordanian-Gazan border, trying to recruit and expand. It's a terrible and it's a difficult question. Would they be forcibly moved into West Bank? And then what strain does that put on that? What does that do to West Bank stability comparatively? Yeah. I mean, these are all really, really, really difficult questions that someone's going to have to consider, because the reconstruction, given the amount of devastation, you can't turn it, an entire sort of, I'm trying to think of the right words to describe it, a city-state into a refugee camp, which is kind of a state that's in right now, with all of its infrastructure destroyed, lots of housing destroyed. So what do you do? I mean, and then could you mount the sufficient humanitarian intervention and reconstruction in there without being attacked? Because then it'll be argued by Hamas, well, this is Western colonization. Iran would be threatened by the idea of money or other influence coming in there. So who do you proxy through? Could you proxy through the UAE or Saudi, who are doing a lot of humanitarian work in there? Maybe, but then Islamists hate the monarchs because they don't want to have a monarchical. Al Qaeda and these people, Muslim Brotherhood, absolutely hate the Gulf monarchies except for Qatar, because they believe that the society should have a supreme religious leader, not a leader by birth. So, would that become a different type of target? Would we see Saudis or Emiratis getting kidnapped? Yeah. Which would, and they're very protective of their people. It's a mind-boggling proposition to begin to consider how you would alleviate human suffering in those conditions. And an end to war, or an end to violence is just the very first start of it. As we saw in reconstruction in Afghanistan, or efforts to build schools, they just get blown up.
Yeah. Is there a difference between Palestinians and Gazans right now? And I should say, let me be more accurate, Palestinians and Hamas. Are there any people in Palestine that would make the logical step of saying, I just want to go make money Israel's great. They treat their Israeli Arabs great. Is there a population there that can just embed and become part of the Israel answer?
Well, there are. And there are any elements that I could speak to this knowledgeably, and large parts I can't. And I try to avoid speaking about things that I don't know sufficiently about.
Fair enough. Yeah, and we can move on from that if you want.
No, it's fine, because at one point we were looking at a project for. They have it sort of a euphemistic name in Israel, which is Arab Israelis, with a larger population in East Jerusalem. And we were looking at employment strategies and things to, help that community, because you had an Arab Israeli, figure in politics there who was, proactive on that kind of front. So they're certainly present. Inside of Palestine, I mean, I can only say on a people basis, I know Palestinians that dislike Hamas, at the same time as being obviously, concerned, unhappy about what's happening to their country from the Israeli side. But Hamas would throw their political opposition off of buildings. They outlawed other political parties. So they came in 2006. So for 18 years, they ruled with an iron fist. In intimidation, torture. There's amnesty reports from 2013-14 on Hamas torture. So once you've been subject to that kind of condition, it's hard to protest. But there's certainly people, that are unsatisfied with it, but I don't know how many. I only, talk to individuals. I don't have a picture on a population in Gaza, but there's certainly, Arab Israelis within Israel as a community.
Yeah. I'm going to have a guy on the show on Wednesday. His name is Adam Gamal. That's not his birth name, but that's the name on his book that he wrote. Grew up in Egypt, moved to America, and just like the classic, I came here with nothing. It was stolen from me. And then he worked his way up, and he's just, he's an incredible story for America. But because he grows up in a Muslim Brotherhood dominated Egypt, because he's basically my age. I'm 54. He's basically the exact same age as me. So he's been through Anwar Sadat. He's been through all of these things. And one of the things he notices as he grows up is because he's Islamic, whenever he sees texts, especially originating from Saudi Arabia, it is not the Islam that he recognizes. It's an Islam of fear, of danger. And so, sort of how Christianity had its moment where it kind of jumped forward, and it's like, hey, we're not going to do this old biblical shit as much as the other. And Islam has sort of waited for that moment to modernize itself and say, yeah, some of this stuff is just obsolete in modern day, right? Like, we're not going to stone humans to death. That is awful. We're not going to kill people because they like someone of the same sex. That is awful. So he looks at that and says, Saudi Arabia is the source of a lot of this programming. And when you don't have enough things, when you are stuck in somewhere like Syria or wherever it is, and the only thing you have left to do is fight because you can't make your own way, well, then you get people that get indoctrinated and inculcated into something evil.
I mean, until you had Mohammed bin Salman, and leaving aside the Khashoggi incident and things, in terms of reform, he's, turned that society around incredibly, quickly. Prior then, obviously, you had, the Islamic religious police, and the royal family was somewhat progressive, but restrained by the power of, the religious police. And he single-handedly turned that around in a very short period of time. Obviously, women are driving. There's a lot more freedom investment into sports and community. And interestingly, I think the figure was he's putting $38 billion into esports. And that sounds crazy, but if you've got a population largely under the age of 25, if they're not educated, they don't have jobs, they don't have engagement, they don't have community, whether that's online or whatever else, or create a sense of pride in themselves, they become recruitable because they're looking for something. They're disenfranchised. So he's making a lot of very intelligent actions to build a more resilient society, and it's in ways that most people think unexpected, but they're the right ways. Otherwise, if you have bored young fighting age males, and then you've got religious doctrine, and there's no employment, you're headed for a civil war.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Muslim Brotherhood, though, by the same token, lose their pool of recruiters, and they lose their source of financing because people stop, providing money.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's not unique to Islam. You see it in you have those, massive evangelical churches in the United States, which are all fear and brimstone. You got to be God-fearing. It's not about compassion. It's not about, your fellow human. It's about obedience.
Right.
Obedience and paying and donating money so they can get a new jet, build a new megachurch. It's the same behavior. It's not unique.
Yeah. You heard me hedging on like where Christianity is, because there are definitely problems with that, right? And
the Reformation of Christianity helped a lot. The Catholics murdered a great number of people. The Catholics and Protestants fought a great deal in the 16th century, and then they fought a great deal in Northern Ireland. It's this idea that, the Islam that I've got to know from 20 years of living in the region is one of compassion, tolerance, and respect. One of politeness. And it's phenomenal. But the behaviors of any organized religion that becomes fear-based and division-based and shouting, and not an intolerant.
Yeah.
No matter what it is dangerous. You got Buddhists in Myanmar, killing people. Buddhism is generally understood to be one of the most peaceful religions. Anyone can do it. No one's got a monopoly on violence.
No. I would like to say humans are great at inhumanity. It's one of our traits.
And it's so dumb.
It's so dumb. So a lot of the criticism we see as part of the information operation is that somehow Hamas is justified in the atrocities. I would even say it's worse than 9/11 when you fly in and you purposely target people to cut their heads off as brutally as possible, and you're raping and all these other things. There is a big bill to pay there, and I'm not going to tell Israel when they've had enough. I mean, if they say, hey, we're sick of this, we're going to go wipe out Hamas and do our best to not kill Palestinians, which, look, we'll sort that out later, right? But once you, and I always talk about the war dragon, once you release the war dragon, it's going to feast. It feasts on anything it wants. It will feast for a long time. But Hamas started this current fight, and they own a lot of the dead people on their side of the fence because they didn't give two fucks about them either. Not only would they shove their adversary off the roof, they'd shove a Palestinian off the roof, right? Because that's the kind of people they are. So how is Israel being heavy-handed as far as we can we know? Are they being heavy-handed? And then what's the solution? Like if they want to wipe out Hamas to the last, and by the way, this is Pete going to say this, you can say what you want to say about it. The second Hamas surrenders and turns over the hostages, the vast majority of the violence stops. Doesn't mean that Israel's going to not chase every Hamas person to the ends of the earth, but it won't be this grisly, destructive, horrible war.
Potentially the violence stops. Because there could be another accelerant thrown into the situation. Hamas gains support with every image of Gazan civilians killed or Gazan suffering from lack of food. And so to them, for terrorists, dead civilians are a net gain. Because that's how they operate, to make governments look weak, or in this case, to make, to position Israel as being this brutalist war machine. And as civilian deaths occur in war; they're unavoidable, but they need to be. A responsible government does everything they can to avoid them to the maximum. If Israel had taken more restraint, then that would have probably given them the benefit of being able to respond when the second or third attack came, because it would have come if they had shown restraint. There was Hamas openly said there was a second attack plan. They just didn't need to. because they've got so much sympathy on their side. But now we're at a point where people will say, "Where's the evidence of the rapes and all these things?" Well, hundreds and hundreds of journalists watched the footage off their GoPros and off their phones. So we're in a world now where evidence, because respect for families and what that video is, that it's just not shown to every human being on the planet.
Yeah.
And so the idea that the evidence is being concealed, no, it's not been concealed. But that would have been the smart move for Israel, would have been restraint. Because if they had restrained, the second attack came, would be like, look, we're going to have to go in more aggressively than we wanted to. We'll take certain steps that we didn't want to because Hamas isn't returning the hostages, isn't doing this, isn't doing that. And they're attacking us again. And then that would have mitigated some of the sympathy for Hamas. But as I said, with a right-wing government, with Netanyahu in position, with a cabinet that he has, and the ultra-right-wing around him that he needs for political survival, that was never an option in the political climate. But it would have been the smart option.
What country would take that option that you could think of right now? Certainly not the U.S. We killed the fuck out of Iraqis. We killed the fuck out of Afghans. I mean, so we certainly can't say that. But can you name a country that'd be like, man, you know what? We're going to hold on, take a pause.
I mean, I was thinking about that today. I don't know who would be mature enough. I'm not saying you don't respond without military force. Like, for example, if when the Twin Towers got hit, what if we didn't invade Iraq? Okay, what if we just went after the Taliban in Afghanistan and did it properly, and followed the threat where the threat was? That would have made a shit ton more sense.
Yeah.
And that would have been the mature and responsible thing. It was an attack that was designed. When I go back to the parallels between 9/11, there's a very good reason for that. Osama bin Laden's plan was the Twin Tower attacks had to be so spectacular. I'm not sure that's really the right word, but it is in some ways, that it forces America to respond and enter wars that would cost American lives and bleed out the economy. Objective number one. Number two was unite the Muslim world against America by seeing Muslim bloodshed by the West. Third was make Afghanistan see the caliphate. Now, he's achieved those objectives, essentially. It's the same strategy with the attacks on October 7th. Force Israel into a position where Israeli lives and Muslim blood's being spilled to unite the Arab world and the world against Israel. Same plan, same playbook. But this time, they succeeded. And for them, that civilian cost, they knew they were going to pay. They knew the moment they launched those attacks what the civilian cost would be. So no one can say this is Palestinian rage. No, they knew what was going to follow. And it doesn't excuse any loss of life that could have been prevented in the response. It's just the horrid, tragic maths, this economic equation that Hamas made. And it doesn't absolve responsibility for civilian deaths. But, it's not about, you can't, I don't know, intellectually I can't absolve responsibility or say permissive to atrocity or irresponsibility of the use of violence. And explain how it happened doesn't mean that it's acceptable.
Of the two parties, Hamas and Israel, Israel is the one that is showing some restraint. Could they show more? I guess we don't really know the answer to that. We would like them to show more, yes. But again, when ceasefires are offered, you don't see Hamas saying, hey, we'd love to cooperate with that. They're very non-cooperative. They purposely put civilians into their fight so that knowing that they would die.
Forever.
Yeah.
In UNRWA was known to be penetrated by Hamas, since 2016, 17. I knew about it around then. Before all the reports were coming out. They have stocked weapons at schools and hospital sites. They've been doing this because those under international law are considered non-combatant. But when you use them for combatant purposes, arguably under international law, you've now made a hospital or a school a combatant site.
Yeah.
Human shields have been a go-to strategy for them for ages. How do you deal with an adversary like that who doesn't have limits, who doesn't respect international law? Well, you can't stoop to their level.
I mean, you can.
You can, but you lose all of your you lose all of your moral ground and legal ground, and you end up with South Africa sponsoring an ICC case.
Right.
So it's a very, very complicated terrain to be the moral partner in. And we would in the West, we think we understand psyops, information warfare, because we're great at advertising. We don't. Our adversaries understand that exploitation much, much better.
Yeah.
And they understand what we react to. Russia famously weaponized Facebook with the help of, we weaponized, I guess to an extent, we weaponized it against ourselves with Cambridge Analytica and Brexit.
Yeah.
But once that was done, rage, emotional, social media became the lingua franca of our online experience.
Yeah.
Rage tweets get the attention. Well, rational conversation gets pushed out of the conversation. And so once rational conversation is pushed out of the conversation, you've only got extreme response. So there really isn't any discussion area for how you do something, how you respond to the unimaginable in a managed way. There's no very. Look at Congress, look at Parliament in the UK. Rational conversation does not take place.
No, it's not possible. Which brings us back to this whole thing of, what country would back off and not go invade places? Okay, we know they're in Afghanistan, but heck of a lot easier to fight in Iraq. And we do have this Uday Qusay problem. So I can see the operational desire to go fight in an open desert. And I'll be damned, Chechens showed up. All kinds of people showed up and offered to die in that cause.
They showed up after the attack, though. It wasn't primarily really a threat.
But we called a fight for any terrorist who wanted to come fight us, and they did come, which is crazy.
We turned it into the octagon.
Yeah. What's that?
We turned it into the octagon.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. And it's horrible. I mean, I'm laughing about it because it's ridiculous, but I don't know that there are different outcomes. If Hamas was spoiling for this fight, well, they got it. And now, they built it, and it's like, here it is. And I wouldn't look, I'm not from Israel. I wouldn't blame Netanyahu that he's like, I'm going to kill every motherfucking Hamas guy I can find. And if I kill some innocent people along the way, that's what they brought, because war isn't gentle. I mean, we want it to be hyper accurate, and we do our best at that. But these are grisly ground fights. Russia and Ukraine, it's not there to save lives. It's there to destroy lives.
Let me be clear about this, because it's somewhat out there.
Please.
The first movements that I knew into Gaza from foreign terrorist organizations was on March 24th, 2023.
Okay.
So this was planned a long way before. This wasn't spontaneous. I mean, the nature of simultaneity indicates it was never spontaneous. But this was not Hamas alone.
Right.
And I would bet my bottom dollar that Hamas alone is not running the media operations. It has got the scent of Al-Qaeda and all over it. Yeah. Because there's a degree of sophistication and production. There's a degree of coordination. There's a degree of when you watch countries speak about things, they get baited much more emotionally, in just reacting and denouncing things, whereas the quality of campaign management for the information operation around this conflict is just way too sophisticated. And just the baseline. But we knew that something was coming. We knew that it wasn't just Hamas, and there's no way that the way it's functioning that it just is. It's where it goes from here, because as I've said, that this is the moment that jihad will not get again, because there is Osama bin Laden formation of Al Qaeda was somewhat a reaction or influenced by his perception of the Palestinian cause. So the idea that this is just locust to Israel or Palestine, it's not. It was a motivating factor for jihad.
Right.
And to consider them not invested in that and participant, it would be the height of ignorance.
Just one more question, because I've had you over an hour, but it's
That's
always so great to talk to you, and I appreciate it. What's one thing that we don't realize about the ground truth in Israel and Gaza? What's one thing that we're not aware of that we need to be?
I probably would say that there's not a lot of discussion, on the Israel side, is probably the dissatisfaction, I think, probably with Netanyahu's reaction. A lot of the public are not necessarily happy with the reaction, not necessarily happy with the society or the conflict. And that, I guess, the way the hostages are used, politically there as well. With respect to families, what they go through. And I would also say that Hamas isn't representative of Gazans. And that if we try to look at them as being a freedom fighter or whatever else, that's completely mistaken, because they've enslaved the population. It's like trying to call the Taliban liberator. They're not. People are not homogenous. People aren't one thing. Most people want to live in peace. Most people want to see their kids go to school. Most people don't want to have rockets landing on their house. It's in any population, and it's the same again, when we talk about religion and these dynamics, same with Christianity. Say 10% of people are extremists. Extremists by nature are more motivated. So that 10% will always take control of the other 90%. And then that 10% will be the singular voice for that 90%, even though the 90% are actually probably pretty decent people.
Yeah.
The extremists will demand obedience. We call these, if you look at Catholicism, we call that a high maintenance religion. And in the same way, extremist Islam is a high maintenance religion because it demands obedience at all times. It's always controlling you. And that's the 10%. And so to mistake, we're at a point now where anyone that's Israeli or says anything different to the narratives is called a Zionist.
Yeah.
And they're just in this point of language, which is just not true. And by the same token, not every Palestinian is a Hamas supporter.
Yeah.
But this polarization is convenient.
Yeah.
Misleading. That's the ground truth. Polarization is a lie.
All right. Well, you have any questions for me? I've been hammering you for an hour.
No. I mean, it's been fantastic. We can catch up on a lot of stuff offline. Explore some papers and concepts and things. But it's been amazing as always, and I always like to hear your perspective on things. As like your take is on the ground truth. You only really get to know that when you spend time on the ground, in conflict, to understand what the impact of conflict is on people and what the real nature of people is. I always think that strikes me is, at some level, normal life, day-to-day life, does go on during war. People try to get on with their lives, and then there are sporadic periods where it's incredibly loud and violent. But then people go back, and that's what anybody wants, to get on with their life.
Yeah. No, you're 100% right on the ground truth thing. You can find a commonality with anybody anywhere. There's someone in Gaza making a warm meal the best they can. Maybe it's from stuff that they pulled out of rubble, but they're doing their best to care for one another. And it's that's a reality of wars. Even when it's horrible, there's still humanity within that humanity, and it's rather beautiful. It's unfortunate that the tragedy has to come to do that, but I hope that we can continue to get Saudi Arabia and Israel closer together. And I don't know what we do about Iran, but I hope that we see that continuing convergence where there is. I've been saying for a long time now, like Israel, person for person, are the most innovative people in the world right now. I mean, their business is just, why wouldn't you partner with them? And you do see Saudi Arabia like imagining this impossible Formula One track and going in a direction that is more their own way, but they are being more Western. They are being more open, more liberal. And yeah, man,
I think it's a simple answer. We just need to make a choice in ourselves, because once you vest your identity, there's something I've been thinking about. This kind of, I guess, a closing point, because it wraps the entirety of the thinking up. Is as individuals, we try to find as much peace and calm within our own minds. And the easiest way to do that is we just stop externalizing our sense of value. Whether that's defining yourself through your job, defining yourself through your political alignment. I am Republican. I am Democrat. I am this. No, you're not. You're a human being. If we define ourselves with our shared humanity first, I'm a human being first, but I have conservative economic values second, you're not going to go wrong. Because when you can look at those values come into conflict with my humanity, then those ideological values need to be reviewed. And, to go to Iran briefly, I have a lot of Iranian friends in this part of the world. They are lovely, lovely people. The Iranian people are fantastic. They unfortunately have a small, concentrated, religious mullah-based government that controls all their lives. But Iranians, as people, don't want to destroy, the world. You have a group of elderly religious leaders trying to, a messianic state ultimately, trying to control a population, 70 million people, just to be in power. But as the people themselves are fantastic. People are generally good.
It's so true. They are generally, and the messianic thing, Ramadan has begun. And not because some old dude in a mosque finally saw that. We know when the crescent's going to fucking show up because we have science. And so even that whole thing, holding on to that, like I'm not in any way trying to put down what Islam does. And obviously Ramadan Mubarak for everybody. But, we've got to get past these guys controlling things because it's not taking us in the right direction. By the way, point that right back at us here in the U.S. because we're glad to go ahead and cause a bunch of problems.
I think there's some beauty in the ritual of something, of a human being. Looking at the moon or whatever else is all the religion has elements of ritual, and I think that's perfectly fine. You could say there's ritualistic elements to the Super Bowl,
sure,
chicken wings, and these they are good, and these things give continuity and punctuation to life. Although we obviously know when the moon is going to be the way it is, but the ritual matters for people of belief, and that's fine.
It is fine. Hey, man, I appreciate you. Let me wrap this thing up and we'll chat. Yeah, I'll talk to you.
Always a pleasure.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much